Hello, Marilyn. Good to see you. We're just
Welcome,
letting
Marilyn.
Hello.
people arriving.
I was thinking, oh, I have to go out again. And then I thought, no, I just have to go to my office. But I'm just finishing some dinner. Is Wendy here? Wendy Knoll was coming.
I don't see her yet, but hi, Janet, and Uta, and Margaret.
Good.
So
Hello.
they're
Hello.
coming around.
Hello, Janet. Welcome.
Hello.
I'm going to deke out at 7:30. I've got to start a meeting on another Zoom and then I'll come back.
Oh,
I
that's the
know.
way to do it. Start the Zoom meeting and then leave, right?
Yeah. I say, oh, yeah, make someone else the host and I'll see you later.
There you go.
Oh, great, Louise. Welcome, Louise.
Well, Louise is muted.
You're muted, Louise.
Mute. Okay. Hi, everybody. Great to
Hello.
see.
This whole thing on Zoom of having to look at yourself so many times and go,
Oh my gosh. Yes.
really? Is this what? Ah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Self-inquiry.
Yeah.
yes. But I know it makes a difference to presenters to be able to see real faces instead of blobs. You know,
Oh, yeah.
I was taking one course and the professor insisted that we all have our videos going, or else he just wasn't going to do the class.
Wow.
Well, I think you can get really paranoid if you just see the faces because the photos of the names there. You think there's nobody there. They're off.
Yeah.
They're off in the kitchen. They're not listening to me at all. Oh.
That's right.
Mhm.
Can
No
feel
idea
that
where
way.
they are, what's happening.
So I'm curious, tonight we're going to move into the tradition of Hinduism.
Nice.
You've been to India?
No, I have
No.
not. Janet has, I'm sure.
I don't know if Janet has. Janet, have you been to India?
Oh, she's not there. She's off having. She's
see her-
off in the kitchen.
I see her shadow there.
Yeah.
Hello, Myra.
There's Myra. Hi, Myra.
Nice to see you.
Ah, hello.
Oh, welcome.
Who's with you, Myra, that you're on mute?
There.
The Upanishads that you gave us the link to the other day, that's Hindu, isn't it?
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Myra, who's with you?
Bill Dovey.
Oh, hi,
Oh,
Bill.
great.
And I'm just trying to get on the big screen. So we're going to have you big here in a minute.
All right.
We'll
So we're
feel
gonna-
the difference.
That's right.
Ooh,
We're going to start off this evening with a little bit about Indian saint, a woman Indian saint, Sri Anandamaya Ma. Say that name many
I
times
know.
fast. It's not easy. So you have to
Mine.
practice. Yeah, right. And I've been with in my heart and in my studies about Anandamaya Ma for several years, but knowing that I was going to bring her forward tonight, I just started appreciating India again as I listened to some music and read through some of what I wanted to bring forward. And if you haven't been to India, maybe you've heard. If you have been to India, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't been, then maybe you've heard about India kind of, what is it? It just hits every one of your senses when you get in there. The smells, what you see, the taste, all the spices, everything. And so as we move into our time together this evening, I just want to invite the spirit of really deepening into what we're bringing forward. This is a class and we're talking a lot, but I want to invite you to move into your heart as much as possible and feel into what Will's sharing, but also what I'm sharing. And Anandamaya Ma was like that. She was born in 1896 and she lived to be 86 years old. She died, she's contemporary, she died on August 27th, 1982 in India. She was born in a small village that is now Bangladesh. And so, but she lived a lot of her life in India. When she was a small child, her parents thought that maybe she was a little slow, maybe she wasn't as smart, something might be off from her. And as she grew into her adulthood and they realized, no, it wasn't that she was off. She was actually always one with God. She was always in that kind of state of the in between the liminal spaces, And I'm going to just give a little background about her, very minimal. And I really encourage you to look her up. I'll put her name in the chat box after a while, and we're going to listen to some music, and there will be some photographs of her that are also in the music. There's so much out there of just devotional kind of videos or music devoted to her. She that was married at 13 years old, which is pretty customary in India. Was less so now unless you're in kind of a remote village, but where girls are married off pretty early. And she went to her husband's home, but he was away for several years before he actually came and met her. And he's probably older than her. I'm not quite sure, but I imagine that was the case. When they met, he was unusual man in many ways, I'd say, especially as perhaps an Indian man where the patriarchal system is so strong and embedded. His name, and I apologize to everyone, but especially my Indian viewers or Indian friends, if I mispronounce his name, excuse me, but Bolanath is how I heard his name pronounced when I looked it up. And when he came into her life and hers into his, he had a deep respect, and he could really see that she was a beautiful young woman, but he could really see the essence of who she was. And there's some things written about their marriage of it was never a sexual intimate marriage, that he really respected that boundary for her. That was not on the top of her list to be in that kind of relationship. What was her life, what in this manifest realm, was to be one with God. There was nothing else. She would say, there is nothing else. That is all there is to be one with God. And so everything that is God. And to be in that remembrance, and that's what I so love about this, because as I was reading, it just brought me back into my practice again. Oh yeah, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, one with God, yes.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about India. When I'm in India, it's so much easier in some ways to be one with God, and it's changed over time now because of the West coming in, and all the tech industry and all of this really taking off there. So it's not, I imagine it's not the same, but it still is. It's still like everywhere you look, there's names, Krishna or Radha or Shiva, all over the place, on trucks, on buildings, people's names. God's name is everywhere. And you can't forget. You just, it's really hard to not be in remembrance for me when I've gone to India. Anandamaya Ma, as she grew in her marriage, her husband was just devoted to her, but she was also devoted to him. When she left home, her mother said that she needed to treat her husband as she treated her father, in the same kind of respectful way, to serve, to be there, to make sure that he's cared for and food is given. And that's a very customary Indian way as well. It might be a little foreign to some of us in the West, especially after women's liberation and things like that have shaped and molded us in different ways of thinking. But that also is, in reading this again, and I knew it already, but bringing it forward in my readings for this course, it just made me, and Will doesn't know I'm going to say this, but appreciate our relationship, our partnership. And one of the things in our marriage vows is to really show up for one another in that way, to really be in service to each other. And if at any time, if one of us feels a call to, on the spiritual path in particular, that we need to try to follow a path in another that way, and the other one does not, then we, and I pray this doesn't happen, but we bow to one another and release release, because we are in partnership, and yet we are God's, and God, the divine, leads us and guides us to where we are. And I do believe we're together because of the mission and the service that we do in the world. And that's how it was for Anandamaya Ma and her husband. I think he really showed up in a way of being of service to her, and while she was rising and people were getting to know her, and they came to her for healing, they came to her because she was the divine. They saw her, she just radiated, and she didn't get out on, and start promoting herself. They just came, and he permitted that, or allowed that. And even now in Indian culture, but in many cultures around the world, that just doesn't necessarily happen for many women or girls. And so it's pretty phenomenal that he did that. Anandamaya Ma initiated herself. She was Hindu, but she also said, I'm Christian, I'm Jewish, I'm Muslim, because there are no boundaries here. And it wasn't an intellectual thing. It was just who she was. And she, as she aged, as she matured, she didn't have much of an education. She didn't go to school. She didn't go to theology school or anything like that. But out of her would come these teachings from all the different traditions and scriptures that she would just be pouring out. And people would say, how does she know this? How does she know this? But it would just be there because she was always so connected. I'm going to pull up a couple of quotes just to give you a sense. Here's I don't know, it's scripture more than a quote, I guess, but she said, when by the flood of your tears, the inner and the outer have fused into one, you will find her whom you sought with such anguish, nearer than the nearest, the very breath of life, the very core of every heart. He says, whether you worship Christ, Krishna, Kali, or Allah, you actually worship the one light that is also in you, since it pervades all things. the other piece that I just love, because if you've known me very well, or even a little bit, and you've heard me speak, one of the practices that my teacher, Sri Eknatheshwaran, really emphasized besides meditation each day was the practice of repetition of the holy name, of the mantra or the zikr, japa in Hinduism it's called. And so that in between your meditation time, hopefully in the morning and in the evening, like bookends to your day, in between, just to silently repeat God's name. And Anandamaya Ma, along with many, many other teachers and enlightened ones, would say that is what we need to be doing in everything we do. And so as I was going in, dipping in again, preparing for this class, I was reminded to bring my mantra up more frequently. She says, wherever God may keep you at any time, from there itself you must undertake the pilgrimage to God's realization. In all forms, in action and non-action, He, the One Himself. While attending to your work with your hands, keep yourself bound to God by sustaining japa, the constant remembrance of God in your heart and mind. In God's empire, it is forgetfulness of God that is detrimental. The way to peace lies in the remembrance of Him and Him alone. She interweaves him and her with the language there. As I was reading that that scripture, that teaching from her, I'm reminded of Yom Kippur, which today is Yom Kippur. It started at the sunset yesterday, and it completes at sunset today. And our friends, our Jewish friends around the world, have been in reflection and prayer, in a time of fasting, and that place of it is forgetfulness of Him that is detrimental. And in Yom Kippur, it's speaking to that's sin, if you would, or missing the mark of forgetting the divine, forgetting that the divine is always here. And yet I know as a Westerner, as a North American, things have been so compartmentalized in my life, and I think in many of our lives, that it's like, okay, I'll go do my spirituality over here, and yet, and it's not integrated. What Sri Anandamaya Ma does for me, as many of the sages and saints, is they help me integrate. That's why it's so important to me to read about them and bring them back in my life to help remember, okay, here we are again. This is, it just was for her. She wasn't separated from it. But for me, I'm still having to keep integrating, keep reminding myself. And I think for many, many people, that's the case. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you before we go into our meditation? Oh, one thing in terms of unity teachings and other teachings, she would become ill at times, but she would do a lot of practices around, breathing practices, spiritual practices to really work with the illness. And at one time, or many times she was asked about illness, and she would say, why do you feel so antagonistic to illnesses? They also come to this body like you do, like your spirit does, right? We come into this body. Illness comes into our bodies. Do I tell you to go away? She said. So you come into the body, you come into each other's relationship. Do I tell you to go away? Why are you telling this illness to go away? Just let it be. It's part of everything. When she got closer to the end of her life, then very close to the end of her life, she was very out in the world. She traveled a lot. She was out meeting with people, but toward the end of her life, she started withdrawing and not writing to her devotees as much or doing interactions. Many say that she was weaning them off of her. Let me back up one moment, because this was really helpful to me when my mom died, which is just about 9 years ago. And because when Anandamaya Ma's husband died, and they were very close, they were so close, and he passed, and she was right there with him. He left his body. He moved from the manifest realm to the unmanifest realm, and her devotees were quite surprised that she wasn't grieving. Why wasn't she grieving over his leaving his body, him not being there anymore? And she said, do you start to wail and cry if a person goes to another room in the house? This death is inevitably connected with this life. In the sphere of immortality, where is the question of death and loss? Nobody is lost to me. She said, he's just in the next room. And that really helped me when my mom died, and when others died. Of course, I had huge heartbreak, and at the same time, to just bring that up, and I know that many of you can probably resonate with that sense of just really knowing our ancestors, the people who have passed, they've not gone anywhere. We just don't see them in the same way. So at the end of her life, she started kind of just doing less work and coming into a place of preparing herself, I think, for her leaving her body. And at the very end, in July, she died in August. In July, she got an invitation to come and do pujas, which are prayers. And the man who invited her urged her that she should get rid of her illness speedily to be able to come. And she replied, this body has no illness. It is being recalled to the unmanifest. Whatever you see happening now is a conduit toward that event. He said, when she said goodbye to this man on July 2nd, she died on August 27th. She reiterated this to him, and she said, as the Atman, which is the highest self within each of us, as the Atman, I shall ever abide within you and with you.
Ever abide within you.
So with that, a little prelude to our meditation time, I'm going to invite you in to just about 10 minutes, I think, 8 to 10 minutes is this video, maybe a little shorter. I can't remember now. I watch so many things. And I invite you to close your eyes at some point, even though there will be pictures of her and some video of her going by. So get a sense of her energy, who she was in what you see. But then I invite you to close your eyes at some point and really let the music, which is a devotional piece. It's a devotional piece just saying the name of God over and over again in Sanskrit. Let that seep into you. And if you feel like it, you can keep yourselves muted. Just start chanting, because the chant of God's name is what, of course, we want to keep inviting in, the name of God. So here we go.
Hare Krishna,
Anandamaya Ma. Shri Anandamaya Ma. Shri is the highest of honorings, or one of the highest of honorings in the Hindu tradition. And so just to close with one of her other teachings, which is so true in my life and Will's in my life, and I think in many of your lives, she says, just as there is definite timetable for work at school, work or school, office or the shop, so should we set apart for divine contemplation for a few minutes out of the 24 hours of every day, preferably in the morning and evening. One must make a fixed resolve that this little time shall be dedicated to God throughout life. During this period, no worldly activity should be allowed to encroach upon the contemplation of God. A fixed time for prayer or meditation must be allotted to all members of the family, including the servants. If this practice is continued long, divine contemplation will become a part of your nature. Once the habit is established, the future course of your life will be made quite easy. You will feel the flow of the mysterious divine grace feeding all your thoughts and giving you new strength. You will get a pension or bonus after years of hard work, so that you no longer need to earn your livelihood. In the spiritual realm, the reward for good, sincere, and selfless work is even far greater and can be attained more easily. So what a blessing that is. And all we need to do is just give our whole hearts to even a few minutes a day, but ideally every part of the day, praying constantly. And the karma bank will be filled, and we will have a great pension plan in place. So thank you all. And as we move through this time, tonight, just holding Shri and Anandamaya Ma in our hearts.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was beautiful, and what a beautiful transporting back to India, and that sort of dissolving into the chanting. I'm thinking that maybe we take 5 minutes right now to enter into that space that she recommended before we move into speaking about a little bit about the Hindu tantric tradition and connecting it to what we've been speaking to so far. So I wonder if we can just gently close our eyes and move into an interior silence and just be present with all that has been brought forward from her teachings. And if you could sense her presence there from the screen, that kind of shimmering radiance that she brings, she is really she was considered one of the teacher of the teachers. She was the one that all the saints of India went to. And Cynthia and I had the privilege of going to her ashram, and the feeling of the energy there is what I'm feeling now from just having witnessed this footage of her. So just feeling that there is this presence of spirit that is just so intense in India, particularly in the presence of one of their great realized beings. And it stays even after they've passed away. If you go to the ashram of Sri Aurobindo or the ashram of Ramana Maharshi in Tiruvannamalai or Anandamaya Ma's ashram, there's that presence that is, it's in the air, it's in your being, it enters your being. So let's just gently close our eyes for a moment or have a soft gaze to the keyboard. Just allowing what she invited, she said, take a few minutes. And many of you most of you probably have your few minutes a day, but let's take a few minutes now and to really move into that interior space of the heart, entering into the eternal, letting go of the concerns of the day, the ups and the downs, and the whole realm of the outer world, which will be there in a few minutes when we come back, but really stepping into this eternal space of the infinite within. And connecting inward to the infinite wisdom and presence within. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace be with you. So there was a question in the chat box about whether she did miracles or how she was recognized. She may well have done miracles. I don't know what miracles she might have done. What I do know is that, as Cynthia said, one of the ways that saints are recognized in India is that they have direct knowledge. They have a direct connection. They speak with authority and not as the scribes do, as it was said of Jesus. And she was that way because she was an unlearned person, and yet she understood the scriptures and she could explain them, even though she had never studied them. So she wasn't coming from a place of study. She was coming from a place of illumined revelation. And that is really the nature, I think, of all deepest spiritual mystics. You know, they have a connection. They have a connection to the source. And so the source basically informs them. And then out come the teachings, which when we receive them in our spiritual toddlership, if you will, we process them intellectually, understandably. We take it in as an intellectual insight. And sometimes it has a quality of a great chasm of depth, and we can feel that depth, but we know we don't know what it is, but we know it's there. We can feel it. And someone who has really walked in those eternal realms and knows them is able to speak from within them. And then the scriptures, the words of the scriptures make perfect sense because they're really articulating something that they know firsthand. And so that's really where she was coming from. And in India, there's pretty good clarity around who is highly realized when there's a large, I mean, not that people don't, you know, make mistakes, and there's all manner of false gurus, like anywhere. But in terms of the depth of the Indian tradition and the ways in which the kind of the greatest saints are vetted, there's no doubt that they are highly realized beings. And Anandamayi Ma was certainly one of them. I just want to say that she also, that one quality of her reminds me of my own teacher, who I've spoken of a few times, and who, you know, I only know that she was a highly realized being. How high, I don't know, but high, I know that. And she also had this quality because I would ask her questions because I was studying the scriptures, you know, reading them, studying them like a good scientist should, you know. And I would ask her questions, particularly about the Hindu scriptures, but also the Sufi teachings and Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, she had a deep knowledge of the Indic tradition, you know, Hinduism and Buddhism, but also of the Western tradition from the inside. I mean, she didn't know the details as much of the Western traditions, but she understood the essence. She knew the essence of it. And I would ask her a question about the meaning of something in one of the Upanishads, and we would go back and forth, and out would come these incredibly beautiful answers. And then the next day, I would actually go into my room and take notes and try to write down what she'd said. And then the next day I would ask a question sometimes about some detail that she had spoken of the day before. And she would immediately say, I have no idea, because that was not my knowledge. And so she would explain that the knowledge was given in the moment according to the need, and it wasn't her knowledge. So, and she emphasized that the key thing is to get connected from within to the one. That is the absolute most essential thing. and to follow that, to nurture that connection. And that's exactly what Anandamayi Ma was saying, that if you spend time every day in that place of deep, deep inner connecting to the one. And when I say deep, deep, if you don't feel it, that's fine. Aspire for it. The aspiration is that longing. And there's a supreme irony in religion generally and in spiritual traditions, which is that, desire is kind of the trap, right? If we get trapped in our desires, I mean, in Buddhism, desire is the cause of suffering. Tanha, they call it thirst. And aversion, desire and aversion, but aversion is also desire in its opposite form. It's basically what you don't desire, which is another form of desire. So desire and aversion, those are the causes of suffering. And basically the cessation of desire is the end of suffering. So in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, desire is the core problem. Similarly in Hinduism, desire and ignorance. And yet there's also the core, the entire core of the practice is this deep yearning in the heart, which is nothing other than desire for realization of God. So a sublimated divine desire is actually your pathway to God. And, the Sufis say very beautifully, they say that, that yearning in the heart will take you back to God. And that yearning is often experienced as a pain in the heart. In certain ways, it's a longing, it's a yearning emptiness that one so wishes to fill. And then even a droplet of fulfillment from that divine plane becomes, it's like all you want. Why would I want more? Because this is the thing that I want. This is that elixir of divinity that is the heart's deepest longing. And so that longing is a form of desire. So it's just an irony that desire is the path to destruction, if you will, or to ignorance. And then that sublimated desire in the depths of the heart is the path to God. So, so anyway, I just wanted to share that because that connection, each of us has that capacity to make that direct connection ourselves. That's the key teaching of all of the traditions. This is not reserved just for the special saints. It's possible for everyone if you have a sincere heart and if you follow where it leads and if you allow the difficulties along the way to be there, because there will be difficulties, and one of them is the purification process, is the deconstruction of all of our illusions. And so anyway, I don't need to go into that more now, except to simply say that desire, that whole transmuting of desire into pure yearning for God, is in a way the essence of the mystical journey. And it's also part of the Hindu tradition in terms of the tantric tradition. In Tantra, and I'm not a master of Tantra, so this comes not from revealed knowledge within, but from scholarly studying and from speaking with teachers about it. But basically the idea is that you transmute the desire into that. You work with the desires and you transmute them and purify them, and then they become vehicles for realization. And that again is this process of shifting from desires being a pathway to ignorance and misery to transmuting it and becoming a pathway to realization. So I want to move to the screen share for a minute and go into this, a little bit of the teaching around the Eastern traditions. So here we go. I'm going to start with a review of what we, just very briefly, just to kind of summarize where we've been, and then we'll move into this direction. So here we are. I believe this is what I need. Start here. So these are again some of the images of the Divine Mother. And there's an image of Kali. And then remember that we were here the other day and we had this six-pointed star, which is really the integration of the masculine trinity and the Sophianic trinity. Sophianic trinity being God the Mother, and then the daughter, and then the Holy Soul. The daughter often being seen as Sophia. And if you turn that, I'm just briefly summarizing, if we turn those triangles a little bit, then we get this kind of configuration where we have mother and father on the same level, at the eternal level, and then at the soul and spirit level as a parity, and then at the Christ level as Christ and Sophia. And this gives more of a kind of gender equality at each level of manifestation. And then from here, this is the traditional Trinity, and of course, the Christ incarnates as Jesus. And then here we have the Sophianic Trinity, and Sophia incarnates as Mary. And this is drawing in particular on the Russian school of Sophiology. And then we put these two together and we come to this. And this was what I was saying, is I understand it as a gender corrected kind of bipartite Trinitarian theology. So there's two trinities here put together. And that this is also the deeper meaning of the six-pointed Star of David. And it graphically depicts this kind of ontological gender equality, parity and symmetry, from the transcendent level to the universal level to the Christ level, and then right down into the incarnation. So now moving from here, some of the Jewish scholars of the Kabbalah and of the Shekhinah, which is the name for the Holy Soul in the Torah and in the Jewish tradition. One of them, Gershom Sholem, has compared Shekhinah to the Hindu Shakti, so in quite some depth, and we'll be looking at some of that next week. But he's one of the leading scholars of the Kabbalah, who's been really working to bring back the female side of God into Jewish mysticism. And basically pointing out that the Star of David and the basic tantric yantra, which it also has the upward and downward pointing triangles, symbolically signify the unity, the divine unity of feminine and masculine principles. So it's very, very striking. And I have found it very striking also that we have those exact same diagrams in the East and the West, evidently independently, created, independently arrived at. And then Raphael Pattay has remarkable scholarship to contribute on this, of which I've only read a few things about him, but he basically speaks to the fact that the mother goddess and goddesses were present from the very beginning in Judaism, in the Holy of Holies. And these are books that I'll just mention them. They are considered significant breakthroughs. Both of them came in the 1990s. So this is The Hebrew Goddess by Raphael Pattay, and this is Sholem's book. He has a number of books, this one being on the Kabbalah. And one thing I'll just mention from my personal astrological interest is that in the 90s, that was at a time of the conjunction of the Uranus and Neptune planetary archetypes. And the scholarship of Richard Tarnas has shown that the birth of new religions always takes place all the way back to, he studied it all the way back to 580 to 550 BC, which is the period that was called the Great Axial Transformation. And that's when that's when Buddhism emerged, and there was a recognition of the transcendent dimension of the divine across the world traditions that was realized on different continents simultaneously. Karen Armstrong has a book called The Great Transformation, which is also all about this. It's called the Great Axial Transformation. And going all the way back to there, which was also a conjunction of Uranus and Neptune. Pluto was also conjunct, so there were 3 of them that were conjunct at that time. But since then, each time there's a religion, a birth of a new religion, there has been this alignment between the planets Uranus and Neptune. And those planetary archetypes relate to mystical dimensions of consciousness. The Christ principle is essentially the Neptune principle, and the divine spark is the Uranus principle, and the two come together, and there's a kind of birthing of a new kind of consciousness that comes forth. So that was happening in the 90s, in the 1990s. And so it's interesting to me that these two, what are considered groundbreaking books that are bringing back the feminine to kind of Jewish mysticism, came forth at that time. Okay, so the book I want to now share with you about tonight, and which has been, I think, is an excellent source for trying to weave together these different ideas. And this is a book by Nila Bratacharya Saxena, and she's actually from India, but is a professor in New York now. This is her second book. Very interesting title, The Absent Mother God of the West, A Kali Lover's Journey into Christianity and Judaism. So she's a Hindu who was born and raised in that tradition and basically is a devotee of Kali. And she's lived it all her life. It's not something that she learned about later, or that she, you know, it's not like a Westerner who, and there's nothing wrong with a Westerner, I'm one of them, who has been so enchanted by India and just opened my heart to it and feel a strong resonance, almost as if I have previous incarnations in India. I wouldn't be surprised, because I sense that I do. India came to me before I ever went to India in various ways. But still, there's something about people who are grown up innate in the culture and then came to the West and then had to grapple with, well, where is the feminine side of God? So in this book, she has really taken that whole inquiry to a deep level and speaks about the nature of the feminine side of God very beautifully. And this book came out, I think, in 2016. I think that's right. So it's, and I'll share and you'll see, but my feeling is it has a lot of rich insight about the Indian tantric tradition and its relationship to the Western spiritual traditions. So Kali is kind of her spiritual foundation. This is her training. She grew up in this tradition, basically in relationship to this very enigmatic and fearsome and powerful and daunting and inspiring deity of Kali, one of the manifestations of the Divine Mother. And so these are just a few ideas from her book, which I want to share with you. These are actually quotes from her book, so you can get a sense of the flavor of her writing. So she speaks about the non-dual great mother of India, inhabits in her tantric form everything, and in her many forms is manifest spirit as well as logos, which is back or Sarasvati. Those are Eastern and Western names for what she has identified are the same God as presence and supreme and transcendental consciousness. So the Great Mother is in her tantric form everything, and in her many forms is manifest spirit and supreme and transcendental consciousness. And she can be intuited by anyone open to her. This is very, very important. That these dimensions of the divine are not inaccessible. And in many ways, may be well more accessible than the sort of the transcendent male God, which in some ways is often portrayed as residing only on the absolute plane, and one has to go to the very highest levels to even reach God. Whereas the Great Mother exists at the very highest levels and the intermediate levels in a certain sense. She is thousands of years old and was never erased from the Indic consciousness. She uses this term Indic to refer not just to India, but also Pakistan, I mean, the areas that are now Pakistan and Bangladesh, and that whole region of the traditions of the subcontinent there. And so she uses this term Indic, and also referring to Buddhism as well. So she's really talking also about the Prajnaparamita and the Tibetan Tantric Vajrayana tradition. So these are all related because the Vajrayana tradition came from Tibet, from India. So it really is a form of exported Hinduism that then went to Tibet, Padmasambhava, I think in the 8th century. So there is this whole very powerful tradition, as you know, in India of the Divine Mother. And it has never been erased. And she says here, thanks to its flexibility and because of her persistence, did not succumb to the extreme religious patriarchy of monotheisms. And there's something, therefore, for us to learn. I personally find it very powerful, the whole interreligious quest and interspiritual quest to me. Part of the value of it is that the traditions contain insights that the others are either lacking or weak in some ways. And so this is one of the areas in which the West has been weakened really by the patriarchal tradition and by the intentional exclusion of the divine feminine. Part of what we were talking about with the work of Gerda Lerner and the ways in which that happened. So there was an intentional repression of the feminine side of divinity in the West. And that's had various consequences, as we know. That is now changing. It's slow, and there are many resisting it still. Probably even most traditional, certainly conservative religious leaders are still very looking at this very askance. But the fact is that the feminine side of God is coming back because she never left. She never left, and there is a deep recognition of the need for balancing our spirituality with the feminine side of God. So then what Nila says here, Nila Saxena, she says, I insert between the existing biblical father God and its apt doppelganger an atheistic scientific materialism. So from her perspective, as a Kali lover, this scientific tradition that we have, this atheistic scientific materialism, is a natural consequence in some ways of having cut off the mother. And we have this biblical father God. And so doppelganger means something that looks exactly alike. You know, it's a term that refers to another person who looks exactly like you do. And so here she's basically saying that there's something that's been profoundly lost. And there's a close parallel between this conception of this far off kind of constitutional male monarch of God the Father. And I'm not criticizing that as a total concept. That has a place, but I'm saying it's lacking something. And she's saying its doppelganger is the atheistic scientific materialism, which also brings great gifts, but is lacking something. It's lacking the mysteries of the soul, even though it's very insightful and skillful at what it's good at. And so she's saying in between the biblical Father God and this scientific materialism is this non-theistic divine mother whose womb of emptiness may cure us of our despairing nihilism and an addictive consumerism. So she comes in between. She is the mediator in a certain sense. She's not only the mediator, but that's a very profound role that I think the Divine Mother plays, because she is in some sense the one that gives birth to creation and therefore nurtures creation as a mother nurtures its young. And so she basically holds the creation close to her bosom. And since we are in the creation and we are manifest here, then we can relate to her, and through her and with her relate to all of the different levels of divinity. And so then she speaks of the gift of the divine feminine as a profound inward turning of the self toward a deeper awareness of one's connectedness to all beings and all worlds. And that is the gift that comes through the divine feminine. Both immanent and transcendent, she epitomizes non-duality and sacred materiality so that we can honor our earthly existence and our interior dimensions. So both immanent and transcendent, she is both non-dual and she is the sacred essence of the manifestation, which has also been denigrated often in Western tradition. And sometimes, you know, the matter is seen as lower than spirit, whereas in fact, matter is the body of spirit. So the two really are not separate and are not, one is not more divine than the other. And here's a line I really love: Mother God. So the approach that that Nila Saxena took here was, where's the feminine aspect of God? It's just, where is it? And so she really began initially to feel that the Mother God was absent in the West, but she eventually did discover it, particularly in the mystical tradition of the Kabbalah, which is really at the foundation of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it's not gone, never was. She cannot be circumscribed by any religious border. She is the mystic river that connects the world's religious ways. That's beautiful. So the divine feminine is, and you know, I think she's related somehow to that whole impulse that's so strong in us, Cynthia and myself, and in our mentors, Thomas Keating, for example, and his deep quest to unite the religions and to really recognize them as different arms of one supreme quest. And also my teacher, who was steeped in the Hindu tradition, was raised a Hindu also, but she had such an intimate knowledge of Christ and of the subtleties of Sufism and of Tibetan Buddhism. So there was a quality, I think, of this, something about the feminine as that river that flows between the religions and links them up and gives them that, makes them wet, if you will. That's what rivers do, right? And gives them life, because the river has the river is the flow of the elixir of life. And so, and then demands, as she says, experiential recognition. So the feminine takes us into experience of God. She's not just a concept. Experiential recognition of non-duality, of mind and body, flesh and spirit, among other more complex forms of dualities. And what I also feel is that when she comes fully back into our Judeo-Christian tradition, there will be, as maybe you are aware, Bede Griffiths, who is a great, well, let me finish my sentence. There will be a resacralization of matter and a resacralization of the earth and a whole recognition that incarnation is every bit as sacred as transcendence. So immanence is nothing than incarnated divinity. And therefore this entire realm of incarnation is no less spiritual and is actually rightly perceived, radiant with the very godliness and holiness that any transcendent experience of God is. And so that, I think, will be part of the healing that will come from opening to the feminine in the West. And I was going to mention Bede Griffiths. Bede Griffiths was, maybe you know, a great Catholic leader and mystic who went to India and lived in India for 50 years, and he founded the ashram there. What's it called? I'm forgetting the name right now. Shivanam, Shantivanam, I'm forgetting the name. But anyway, he founded this ashram, Shantivanam, that's it, and founded this Christian Hindu ashram. It's really a kind of a place for the meeting of Hindu and Christian mysticism. And others joined him there, most notably Abhishektananda, who came from France. But anyway, toward the end of his life, Bede Griffiths had an awakening of the feminine. He was quite old. I think he was in his early 80s. And I think he had a stroke of some kind. But in the course of the stroke, he had a total awakening of the feminine, of the spiritual feminine, of the divine mother, who penetrated his entire being, who entered his being, who flooded him. And I'm gonna just pause here if I can exit. I'm trying to think how do, oh, there we go. Just so I can talk to you for a minute. So he basically was completely blown away by this awakening of the Divine Mother that infused his entire being. And he realized that all his spiritual life, and this is a very advanced Christian mystic who had written many powerful books, you know, The Marriage of East and West, and he wrote The River of Compassion, a deep commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. He was one of the mentors of Andrew Harvey. Andrew Harvey knew him personally and was very fortunate to, you know, to have him as one of his teachers. So he's a remarkable mystic, one of the greats of the 20th century. He had blocked off the feminine. He was closed to it and didn't realize it until this experience happened late in life. And then he had this major awakening. And he realized that there was a whole aspect of divinity and of God that he had rejected without realizing it. He wasn't trying to reject it. It was just that the whole tradition in which he was formed precluded it. And so he'd been unaware of it. And it included an awakening to the sacredness of life, to the sacredness of sexuality, all of it, which, as we know, you know, in the Catholic tradition has been associated with so much repression and guilt. And so it's shunned. So anyway, that's an example of what happened for him as an example in a way of what will happen for the entire tradition when it is healed through opening to the divine feminine. So, okay, I'm going to go back to screen share now. Sorry, I'm so slow at this a little bit. So let's see, let me get back to where we are here and then we'll take some time. for some small groups. So here's this statement. She is the mystic river that connects the world's religious ways and demands experiential recognition. It's very beautiful. So you've got to enter into the path and become it in a way. And then she makes this statement: in the desperate effort to erase the divinity of the woman, all goddesses, this was in the West, were turned into devils and manifestations of evil. And therefore the transcendent male God is then marked against immanence, because immanence is this world. And that's seen as part of the feminine aspect. So the whole side of immanence and the divinity of the feminine was erased in certain ways in the West. And then, of course, what that meant for the West is encountering India was that India's goddesses were basically seen as these, remnants of a degenerate religion, both by Christian missionaries and rationalists alike. So that was all seen as that sort of ancient mistaken mythology that has nothing to do with reality. But then we have this Zohar, and we'll be talking about the Zohar more next week, which was the central text of the Kabbalah that appeared in Spain in the 12th or 13th century. And Zohar means radiance, and it is a mystical text about the divine feminine, and basically asserts very clearly that God is half male, half female, and brings them back together into this sublime communion with complete sort of beloved and even sexual symbolism. So it has a very, very similar quality to some of the Hindu tantric deities and their consorts. And here in the Zohar opens to the fact that God thinks, God feels, God responds. God is affected by the human realm. This is so important. One of the key teachings in the Zohar, according to Daniel Matt, who's probably the leading translator in the world, and we were fortunate to meet him and take a bit of his courses. And he says that one of the key lessons of the Kabbalah and of the Zohar core points is that God is half female, and that God really is this combination of what we call masculine and feminine qualities at every level. And we'll be looking into that more next week. And so, but here, what the Zohar itself says, God thinks, God feels, God responds, God is affected by the human realm. So he and she, the divine masculine, God the Father and God the Mother, comprise the divine androgyne. And their romantic and sexual relationships, one of the most striking features of the Zohar. That's not the Zohar. I'm sorry, that's not it saying that. That must be a quote from someone about the Zohar. But it is, in any case, that's the nature of that particular mystical text. And so what is so important here that that Daniel Matt emphasizes is that, first of all, this idea that God is half feminine. And secondly, the idea that God needs humanity to be fully God, that God co-participates, that it's absolutely crucial that we recognize that much as we need God, God needs us. And God needs us to experience the fullness of God's divinity. Even Araby, I believe, says similar things. And I will be looking into that more. I would like to bring that into a future class here. So this is a beautiful kind of integrating synthesis of the human and the divine. It's a two-way flow. We're not just down here with a God up there who's watching over, unconcerned and just detached from it all. We are interconnected with a living divinity. And that God needs us, just as we need God. God needs to experience human life and human experience as part of God's divinity in order to be fully God. And now we do have a quote from the Zohar. And what I want to point out is how close this is to an image of Kali. So just reading this is from a Western mystical text about the divine feminine. And just reading it, 1,000 mountains loom before her, and all are like a puff of wind to her. 1,000 mighty streams rush past her, and she swallows them in one swallow. Her nails reach out to 1,070 sides. Her hands grasp on to 25,000 sides. Nothing eludes her rule on this side or the other. Now, by the other, they refer to the dark side, the Sitra Ara. So this is the, there's the side of the light and the dark. We'll say a little more about that in a moment. How many thousands of potencies of judgment are grasped in her hair? So in that kind of description, it seems closer to this kind of image. I mean, I'm not trying to make an exact identity here, but there's all of the arms, and there's this, incomprehensible power and mystery. One difference, or potential difference, depending on how it's interpreted, is as what we see here is that Kali is standing on Shiva. And so Shiva, as the masculine principle, is seen as the inert and receptive principle, and Kali is the active one. And that is in some ways, to some degree, a difference between the Western and Eastern traditions. Although even in the West, the masculine side of God could be seen as the absolute Godhead that is aloof, transcendent, and then the feminine side, the Shekhinah, is the manifesting power within the universe. So all of these things have different interpretations from different angles, and I think it's important not to get attached too much to any one particular intellectual representation of them. So we mentioned the dark side. I want to just touch on that briefly, and then we'll have some time for small groups. An important understanding in the Eastern traditions is that the divine mother in particular, she's not only this benevolent mother, this adoring beloved, but also is this, force to reckon with, and has a dark side and an annihilating side, and contains in her being, or in the divinity, what we call evil is also part of it. And this side may appear strange and unacceptable, to our normal sensibilities, but it's consistent with the mystic and the non-dual concept of the divine, in which the so-called evil also has a clear place. We see this even in the Bible, in the book of Job, for example. Satan, who is basically traumatizing Job, is working for God. Satan goes back and forth to God and basically he gets God's permission to go and basically traumatize Job even more. But it's very important to notice that Satan is kind of working with God. There's some aspect, it's not like he's totally separate. So there's a way in which the dark side is part of the full spectrum of divinity. And she also raises this point, which I've heard before, but it's a very interesting point. Speaking to the dark side, what if extreme male violence is itself a symptom of a profound hunger for God the Mother and the denial of the yin aspect in the male psyche? And I think this is at least a credible question to hold, because there is, in the denial of the mother, there's the denial then of the feminine side of one's being. And there is naturally then a hunger for that to return. And it's kind of curious that materialism, the very word materialism, has in it mater, which means mother. So mother meaning manifested, birthed existence, if you will. And so it's an irony that there's a kind of grasping at this desperate materialism that we find in sort of scientific, atheistic scientific materialism, which is almost like a pathologized form of grasping at the mother. It's grasping at her material body, or one aspect of it, but then betraying everything else. And so being left with a kind of an empty shell and a sort of desperate quest to make the material be the sacred and the divinity. And in a sense, the secular material quest could be seen as a consequence of this shadow side of the loss of connection to the Divine Mother. So I don't want to go too far into that tonight, but just touching into that briefly. So I've been speaking a lot here. I wonder if we might just pause for a bit and take some questions or reflections. Guess we're down to a couple people.
Yeah, a couple people had to exit, unfortunately.
Okay.
Marilyn's coming back, so I think it's probably better to not go into groups right now. Otherwise, she'll be dropping in.
Yeah, that's good. I thought we maybe, because I've been just speaking so much, we might just open it up for a little discussion or reflections or comments, if anyone has any questions or comments. I think, Myra, I think you're muted.
Unmute. Okay. Well, I'm blown away by what you just said about mother matter, the inside being repressed and being expressed as this extreme consumerism, a kind of madness against matter, against the earth, and also the misandry part. I had a friend who introduced me to that word. And I think I've had some of it actually in the past. I think I'm cured. But just those two ideas of revulsion or separation from the two sides and different ways they could be manifesting or are manifesting, especially given the way the world is being treated now, the earth and the waking up call and all that. Yeah. Did you hear that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when you speak, about the way the earth has been being treated, I mean, the earth is a sacred living being. And, the Kogi, the indigenous peoples of Colombia, they speak about how it pains them to see the Western cultural ways because they see our blindness to the fact that the earth is a living being that can feel. And they've said, if you knew that she feels all of this, you would stop doing what you're doing. So there's that cutting off of connection. And in a certain way, in our culture, in our sort of atheistic, materialistic culture, we have been trained to see only the material aspect of reality. And we then have a kind of heavy foot upon the earth because it's just a piece of ground. And so we have lost our sensitivity to the fact that it's a living being. And we just walk on it, as opposed to, as Thich Nhat Hanh used to say, bless the earth with each step, and then the earth blesses you. And there's this communion of energies in the walking. There's a kind of lover-beloved relationship between the human being and the earth, which is how it's intended to be. And all of that gets lost. And it becomes a mechanistic relationship. But there is an irony in that quest for materialism.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Matter. I mean, I always kept going back to the Council of Nicene in 325 AD or whatever. You know, and when they conflated, you know, feminine with earth, and, you know, Rome came in and it was this whatever control trip, it seemed to me. I mean, what better way to control? I suppose that's a negative way to look at it than to split something that is whole, and also conflate the feminine with the earth or matter, or, you know, the manifest universe. I mean, a lot of people go, "Oh, it's always been that way," and I know it's always been that way. But I mean, one looks for where it started or why. You know, it wasn't that way in Buddhism and Hinduism and all the wonderful female goddesses, which are now coming back and being looked at. And but anyway, sometimes I want to, like women who run with the wolves, trace the traps, trace the steps that got us here. You know.
Yeah.
I don't know what you have to say about that. You've been saying a lot, really.
Yeah, no, I think what you're speaking to is very much part of what is happening. Like you say, it's coming back. And part of these quests, I mean, like Gerda Lerner's work, looking back before the goddess was lost and asking, how did we lose her? How did this happen? How was the feminine side of divinity cut off and cut out of the deal? And when was it not like this? And it was not like this at one time. So how can we reclaim it? And that's part of the gift, really, of the interspiritual awakening that's happening. I mean, it's not simple, you know, and there's a lot of false paths, but India and Buddhism have brought a tradition to front and center that have not torn away the feminine, at least on the divine plane. Now, the reality on the ground in those countries, you know, is still highly patriarchal and repressive. So it's a very interesting contradiction there. And I've asked a number of people from India, and the ones that I've talked to basically also are sitting with that as a mystery. How did we end up with a religion that so reveres the divine feminine and a society that represses women so soundly? Quite remarkable.
And that's taken place on a global basis, though. There's really been nowhere in the world that seems to have escaped the repression or of women, which is amazing in itself, because most things were never united on. So somehow we've managed to unite on that front.
Very good point. Yeah, no, it's true. It's pretty universal. That's why it's, you know, if we could address that one, we could have a pretty systemic change in human civilization. Yeah.
I listened to the collective trauma summit, you know, coordinated by Thomas Hubel this weekend. Lots of it.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
There was a fellow on there, Terry Reel, who I didn't know.
Yes.
He blew me away, and made me excited when I heard him say that it is the millennial men that are now leading the way to this unification of the male female, you know, and made me very excited because I have a 30-year-old son, and something quite special happened with us this summer, where he's very science minded at McGill and physics, and something just broke through it. And I don't mean destroyed the scientific, because as you say, it's got a lot of wisdom, but it's very chopping and blocks, and something happened that, so I feel that happening. That's exciting. Do you think that's happening?
Oh, absolutely.
Young
No question about it. Yeah, no, and we see it in our work. I see it at the interface of science and spirituality. I was actually very drawn to that myself. So do you have any more to say about what happened at that summit? I mean, Terrence Real has written really some of the best books on the transformation of the male psyche. You know, I Don't Want to Talk About It is one of his books. basically how men don't want to talk about certain things. That is what they most need to talk about.
Yeah. His title was, I Don't Want to Talk About It. Yeah. Well, I'm going to look at it because I want to read about it.
Yeah, no, he's written several books. He's one of the really sane voices out there. But
Oh.
that's very good. I hadn't heard that about millennial men.
I was
But-
in this experience, and I just suddenly let my eyes open to it, and all of a sudden in the last few days, floods of stories are coming to me about this. Just because, like I've been a feminist and it's been pushing young women, so I have to let my misandrist eyes, oh, this could be happening. Ooh, it's men. No. It needs to happen. Anyway, yeah.
That's beautiful, Myra. And we have a millennial man with us right here tonight, who is an example, I think a living example, if I dare say so, of exactly what you're speaking to. I think there's a major change happening. And I mean, Steve Bannon was right if you heard him make that statement that the anti-patriarchal movement is going to undo 10,000 years of recorded civilization. And we would agree with him, except that he was lamenting it and we celebrate it.
Exactly.
I'm waiting for that comment. I'm going, oh my God. He's lamenting it. Yes.
Because nothing essential will be lost. I mean, this is the thing. We will still retain those valuable aspects of Western civilization, but we will begin to return to a more soulful culture and, re-enchant the world. And there is a collective trauma, and the patriarchal conditioning and the denial of the feminine, and that imbalance has been very, very ruinous. So
Men and women, like read this article by Sarah Payton today, who's been my guru in family constellation work for 5 years. But she said, I didn't make this connection, that the patriarchy really is about individual. It was about individual because the what's the word? The opposite of individual, or the complement. The interdependency was a threat to patriarchy, because then we will get together and we will bond together. But if we keep everything separate, so I'd never quite connected the patriarchy with the damage it's done to men and women, and making us feel we have to be independent, go it solo. We don't need each other. We shouldn't show our vulnerable side. And I know that about patriarchy, but I didn't, because I've been looking at the hero's journey, thinking, and Charles Eisenstein realizing, yeah, we're beyond the hero's journey, conquering the good against evil. And anyway, all this stuff is kind of flooding in new ways, new configurations, and it's exciting.
that's great. Thank you.
And challenging as all of this has been and is, on some level, I think it's part of evolutionary process, and we've gone that route for some reason, and we're now moving on to a more holistic, more loving, more healthy society. But I think we needed to forge in whatever direction we've been. Personally, that's my sense, is God is all there is. So how can he get it wrong, or she get it wrong?
So it's a stage in the process.
It's a stage in the process that we're coming
Yeah,
through.
yeah.
And there's been tremendous changes. Eternity is a very, very long time. And so from any single point, you don't see all of the applications and permutations. It only develops through time. I mean,
I'm just wondering how COVID is going to influence this movement.
How who?
COVID.
Oh, I think COVID is one of the factors that's pushing us into the birth canal, because it's bringing a lot of things up, and people have to deal with their repressions and their anxieties, and they're being pushed into their pain body in a sense. But on the other side of that, I think it's like re-recognizing that we are a whole community, that we're all interconnected, that we can't get away from that. That
There's going to be a polarization. It's going to be more more sense of interdependency, but also there's going to be more reaction, more sense of separation, like the Steve Bannon, like the Trumps. They're just going to kind of, there is so much polarization now, so it's going to go two ways. So which way will win out? I don't know.
I'm a perpetual optimist, so I'm saying we're getting it right, and I'm listening to people that that certainly seem to understand that this is the birthing process of a new way of being. So, and as far as I'm concerned, taking that approach can never be a harmful one, because if we uplift our energy, we add more value to the collective than if we sit in a place of fear and dismay and apprehension about what's coming. So the more we can stay connected in our hearts and in that place of love, the more we can help the process evolve peacefully and harmoniously. And doesn't mean that there aren't going to be some more bumps and pains and contractions along the road. But in the end, we're all energy. So it's not so much in the physical doing, it's more on the energetic level that shift takes place, that things shift and change on the planet, because we are all the one.
Yeah. What did you think, Yuta, about the statement that Will made about the dark side, that Satan isn't exactly the opposite of God? I mean, there's some role for him. I too, for example, I don't want to get rid of my view of this dark side of things that I think is happening. I want to be positive, yeah, but I want to be wary. Like in Women Run with the Wolves, I want to be wary of those traps. I want to be wary of contradictions, like Big Pharma selling things, and promoting the health agenda, and yet they're the ones to gain from it. I mean, how do I guess I'm just posing this to all of you. Is it possible to keep both views, the dark and the positive?
Well, the positive will include the dark.
Okay.
It just incorporates more totality.
Yeah, it's on a human level. I mean, on planet Earth right now, we have some negative forces. Don't get me. I'm not saying that that's not the case, that we don't have, in a sense, I mean, we could call them malevolent or whatever. But that's on planet Earth. That's on 3D planet Earth. And where we're moving, that's going to be, I believe, a lot less of the equation as we remember more of who we truly are.
You mean moving to 3D to 4D, but also
5D.
5D, but the eminent, not leaving the beautiful matter, the earth, the incarnate. You don't mean that. You just mean
No, we don't need to leave the earth in order to evolve ourselves, and that seems to be at the process that we're at.
So I'll come in with teaching from Sri Anandamaya Ma. She says, joys and sorrows are time-born and cannot last. Therefore, do not be perturbed by them. The greater the difficulties and obstructions, the more intense will be your endeavor to cling to God's feet, and the more will your prayer increase from within. So that brings us back to practice. And I think that, you know, if you've been meditating, practicing in prayer, you know, I realized I could feel it years ago that I was preparing for something. And now we're in this and I'm like, I don't know if I'm prepared. Really, really, God? I could have used a few more years.
You got more than you bargained for.
We all have. It's just like,
But still, you know, the practice is it, and that's going back to the teachings, and in particular Anandamaya of saying, you know, that's where the focus is. Just stay focused there, and then all the ups and downs and ins and outs, the birthing process. It's like a mother who is giving birth. She stays focused on the breath, on the breathing. That's the practice, right? And so, and we are. I think I agree with you that we're in a birthing process, and it's not an easy birth. Not an easy birth. Lots of lessons to be learned.
lots of support needed around, lots of midwives.
Lots of midwives, yeah.
Lots of midwives, and I'm reminded of this statement from Valentine Tomberg, who wrote this book called Meditations on the Tarot. But it's really a book about Christian Hermeticism. And he basically is talking about the power of the alchemical transformation process, and the fact that ultimately all so-called evil is simply, they are forces that need to be faced and essentially transmuted into something good. And that can happen. And he basically says that the mystic principle, and ultimately the only hope for the human future, is that what we call evil is transmuted. It's not negated.
Thank you.
Cannot be just wiped out. It has to be transformed, and transformed into something that is positive and good, and that is possible, that is happening, that is what we need to hold and pray for, and that will basically eventually be our salvation in it. So he's pretty clear about it after this whole deep theological engagement. That's one thing that he comes to.
What is his name again? Valentine?
Valentine Tomberg, Tomberg.
I would agree. You can't try and get rid of something. As soon as you try and get rid of something, it's like taking on tar baby. You punch at them and you just get.
And in some
Stuck in
sense, that's what we're here for. We are here doing a grand and profound process of divinizing all of existence. We are a little cog in that grand spiritual project, which has dimensions that we don't understand, and levels that are far beyond us, but we are participating in it. And there is something, I mean, we see it in our work, in the little work that we do. We see it in the work of our friend, Sister Lucy Currian. I mean, she's facing unbelievable trauma and creating in the midst of that violence and incredibly repressive rural India, creating these oases of love and hope. And they are literally transmuting those cruelties and darknesses into a place of love and mutual nurturing. It's quite remarkable. And that's just one example, but I think that there's something very profound in that. And I would suggest that we maybe close by just moving into some prayer together and really praying for this transmutation, because it is the process. You know, as Tenzin Palmo said, Donald Trump has Buddha nature, you know? So all across the globe, we're all basically in a process of doing our best, however ignorant we are, and trying to wake up. And basically that as this awakening continues to grow and deepen, by its nature, the darkness and not so much the darkness will always be there in some form, but that which we call evil will be transmuted. And that we can hold that prayer legitimately because we have many of examples of it having happened. And it's happening now in different ways. And so it's a legitimate prayer to hold both for the world, for humanity, and also for our participation of playing our particular role in that process. So I'm just going to invite us to gently close our eyes for a moment, or have a soft gaze to the keyboard. And just to move inward and into that prayer, asking God, may I be an instrument. May I be used as an instrument for thy work, for thy love, so that I may be part of the transmutation of evil, of cruelty, of injustice into love and into healing and harmony. That is what my heart yearns for, and my prayer is that I may be an instrument of that process actually taking place. That I may do my little part in that grand alchemical transmutation. So let's just sit in silence for a few minutes with that prayer in whatever way that prayer speaks to your heart.
Silence, you feel moved to verbalize what your prayer is, feel free to do so. coming to class, being enriched in this conversation. It's enriched me in my life, and it's nice to be in community. I see you all.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you to the YouTube audience. We have 2 or 3 people out there, I think. Just as if we were meeting in person, if you'd like to do a love offering, Garrett's going to put the links in the chat box. So we're grateful at Unity for any love offerings you're giving, any donations. And if you'd like to do anything tonight, it's deeply appreciated. So
As you know, all the programs at Unity are supported purely by donations. So your donation is a divine blessing to this mission. So
And
thank you
we
for joining
will-
us.
yeah, we will see you again next week, perhaps, and we'll go into more of the Divine Feminine. And just a reminder, Janet Law is teaching a class on Wednesday of the Quest. And then we have our morning meditations Monday through Saturday at 7. So feel free to drop in at any time, any day. And there's probably more. I know Reverend Bob Trask is starting up soon, but I don't have that in my mind of what the date is. So go to Unity
October 7th.
Vancouver. October 7th. Okay, it's coming up, but not this week. I don't think this week. No, next.
Yeah, no, next week.
Okay, so be sure and check things out. Lots starting to happen in the fall time here as we're going inward. You can stay connected. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
all.
Bye-bye.
Be
Nice to
well.
see you, Myra. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's very good to
Good
see
to
you.
see you.
Connect. Do some art.